On rare occasions, a flicker of light penetrates the gloom of this world, and one such flicker occurred last week when the transitional government in the country of Sudan decided to refer the former president Omar al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court for prosecution. Now, Bashir, as you may know, came into power in a little bloody coup in 1989, and he ruled with terrible, merciless brutality for over 30 years. And quite naturally, in the course of that 30 years, there was resistance to his brutality, and it sprang up in a western region of the Sudan called Darfur. And of course, he moved in to oppress it severely, savagely. 300,000 people died, and some 3 million people were uprooted from their homes. So quite predictably, in 2010, in the middle of it all, the International Criminal Court indicted al-Bashir for crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now, he avoided prosecution in the intervening years simply because his own government wouldn't refer him to the International Criminal Court in The Hague in the Netherlands, but also because a number of African countries, amongst them South Africa of all things, and indeed the Africa Union itself, gave him protection. But then last year, he was overthrown by street demonstrations. He was found guilty of corruption in a trial. Can you imagine? When they arrested him, he had $130 million in his home, presumably under his mattress, and he was sentenced to 10 months in what amounts to a pretty comfortable setting rather than prison itself. Well, he's not alone, even though he was the first indicted president in Africa. And one of the problems that has arisen is that the International Criminal Court, which has been in place for roughly 18 years, has focused entirely on Africa. That's how it's happened. And the only indictments that have been made have occurred around people, individuals, and countries in Africa. And indeed, very few prosecutions have actually happened. So there is a sense in Africa of injustice. And indeed, it's not just al-Bashir, that's the problem. It would be perfectly legitimate to indict the former president of the Gambia for crimes against humanity. He's now hiding in Equatorial Guinea. The dictator in Equatorial Guinea should be indicted for crimes against humanity. So too in Burundi, and in Cameroon, and in Togo, and in Gabon, countries with which people are not entirely familiar. But then Africans say to themselves, surely there's a double standard here. Why is it just Africa? Good question. Why not the president of Myanmar? Or maybe Aung San Suu Kyi? I mean, just imagine a former Nobel Peace Prize winner being indicted for crimes against humanity. What about Assad in Syria? Surely he's an obvious candidate. And of course, taking the double standards further, you'll never get George Bush or Tony Blair indicted for what they did in Iraq, and you can't contemplate indicting the president of China for the terrible crimes against humanity now occurring against the Uyghurs, the minority group in China. It's really difficult, isn't it? And the International Criminal Court is struggling. But I have to say that taking al-Bashir to the court and trying him and rendering a judgment and putting him in prison for life makes eminent sense. That was last week. I'm Stephen Lewis.